And we are live in a living color from the Sports Talk Nation right here on YouTube. Michael Cohen here with you, your host, as I have a very special guest from San Francisco, California. He writes for Around the Foghorn on Fansided.com, and that is Michael Saltzman. We are going to talk about the San Francisco Giants as they get ready for the 2018 season. The Giants coming off what for them was a rather surprising and even disappointing year, because that was a team that had high expectations in 2017. Things did not work out. Of course, injuries played a big part in that, especially with their ace Madison Bumgarner. They come into this year in 2018 retooled. They bring back a lot of familiar faces, but they also bring in several new faces, especially offensively. We'll talk about them throughout the course of the show today. So before we get things going, Mike, I want to welcome you aboard. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you. I love being on your show. Feels like a yearly tradition and is really exciting, so I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's so good to be back, talking baseball and all that. Looking ahead to the Giants and looking ahead to this season, like I said in the open, they've added a lot of offense. Now, in years past, this has been a team that hasn't been a big power hitting team. Even during the years when they won the World Series, they were never a big power hitting team. They did very, very well with small ball. Situational baseball was the name of their game, and of course, they relied on the pitching. This year, you have the two big starting pitchers in Cueto and Bumgarner. You have some questions on the back end of the rotation, but offensively, if Longoria can stay healthy and produce what he used to do in Tampa Bay, if Andrew McCutchen can have a big year in what's basically a walk year contract for him, if you can get anything out of Austin Jackson in center field, and I know he's very, 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 very inconsistent throughout his career, but this is a much deeper lineup as far as offense is concerned in power and run production than we've seen from the Giants in quite some time.
Well, I know a lot of fans were, overly concerned, and I think even going into this offseason, at best, the most diehard Giants fan was cautiously optimistic at best, because of how bad last year was. I mean, 98 losses isn't going to go away anytime soon. That's a permanent, tattoo on the 2017 season. So the question then becomes: is that an outlier, or is that the new trend? Is the current core players of Posey, Crawford, Belt, Panic, Bumgarner, Cueto, is that core done, or is that core just having the perfect storm bad season? Mm-hmm. And I think by the ads of Longoria and McCutchen, especially like you're saying with McCutchen in the walk year, this is absolutely the Giants thinking, okay, regardless of what happened last year, we think it was just an outlier. We're going to try to build for 2018 and then worry about 2019, a year later, instead of tear it down, dump all our veterans, get something for Posey, get something for Bumgarner, mm-hmm. and do things at extreme, because I think while that may have been the right move in some analytical way, because the Giants are so foreign to that idea of giving up for 2 or 3 years, that their, I think, feeling was, we're not going to give up on Bumgarner, mm-hmm. we're not going to give up on Posey. Well, if we're not going to do that, right now every other veteran we have is coming off a bad year, or at least coming off a down year, right? Belt had a strong year and then got a concussion. Now that's 4 concussions. So who's going to trade anything of value for a guy coming off a 4th concussion, mm-hmm. right? Cueto had injuries last year, so Cueto goes from all-star starter to, fringe player in 1 year because of injuries. So you're not going to get much for him either, especially when he's going to have that 4 more years on his contract. Pence is in the last year of his deal, but it's at $18 million, and he hasn't proven in the last couple of years he can stay healthy. Mm-hmm. So whatever value you had and whatever veterans you had, you need to bank on them getting back to their baseball cards.
Yeah.
Maybe Hunter Pence won't because he's 34, but there's no reason to think it's not possible that Panic, Crawford, Belt, Posey all can. Mm-hmm. And if those 4 pieces all do, adding Longoria and McCutchen make a lot of sense. Now, if they don't, if you don't, then you got McCutchen and Pence leaving, and you're stuck with Longoria's contract regardless of what he does, but you're sitting there with a bunch of veterans who now have 2 years of underperforming.
Yeah, absolutely. And if even if the Giants were not competitive, let's just say we get into July, and they are kind of a fringe team. They're in between being a contender or being out of the playoffs. If some of these names that you just rattled off, like a Buster Posey, like a Johnny Cueto, are having good years and are starting to look like they're playing back to their potential, and if the Giants feel they're out of it, well, now you can try to get some pieces for those guys if they can start to produce at that same level. It's kind of the same thing what we see here in New York with Matt Harvey. He's been on the downside of the last couple of years, hasn't pitched to the baseball card, and he needs to pitch better this year so the Mets can think of possibly trading him. So I totally see where you're coming from on that one.
Well, I think ultimately, no matter how, like I said, go back to like the idea of a diehard fan. Every Giants fan right now is nervous. Even if they're excited about Longoria and McCutchen, or adding Tony Watson, or adding Austin Jackson, or just the fact that there's some depth finally, which they didn't have last year. Mm-hmm. You can't help but be nervous because there's no person on the 25-man right now that didn't have some version of a question mark last year, whether it was Posey, not hitting for power the way he had in previous years, Bumgarner's injury, now all of a sudden, Paul Bunyan's just a human, stuff like that. Even someone like Samardzija, who had a strong year, his numbers weren't sexy at all. He didn't have the win totals that some people want in a starter. He didn't have the ERA that people look for. Some of his numbers that were amazing, like strikeouts to walks, even though that's impressive to most fans, it's not the first thing you notice when you see a pitcher. And so those things are starting to change, I think, with more people realizing that analytics have some value and that some raw numbers are just misleading. Mm-hmm. And strikeouts to walks is pretty easy to figure out why that would be valuable. But even with that, he gave up a lot of home runs. So even for the guys who had strong years had some question marks. And so I do think that the Giants were a 500 team that absolutely played to the worst of their abilities at times last year, and it led to 98 losses instead of 81. I think they didn't realize how far away they were from a 90-win team going into 2017, because they looked at it like, hey, we made the playoffs still. We were the best team in baseball first half of 2016. Mm-hmm. Second half of 2016 was just an aberration. All we need is a closer. We got Melanson. We're good. Yeah. And so, when Melanson got hurt, it was like, oh, okay, we still can be okay. And the reality was 2016, as it turns out, they needed more than just a closer. They needed someone stable at third base. They needed someone stable in the outfield, especially defensively. Denard Span just wasn't the outfielder that they were hoping. Mm-hmm. Hunter Pence got old much quicker than they were thinking because injuries made that fast forward quick.
Right.
And so suddenly a guy who was playing 162 a season all of a sudden couldn't get on the field. And when he didn't have the defense that he had before. So all of a sudden you're really bad defensively in the outfield. You don't have your ace in Bumgarner with his, the dirt bike.
Right.
So all these things are happening. Meanwhile, Posey's good, but he's the only guy in the lineup, so you can pitch around him. It would be like, in New York, if, Cespedes is having a great year, but nobody's batting, before him or after him. Then you just pitch around him.
You'd be surprised how true it is. Last couple of years we just hit on right there. You hit the nail on the head of that.
And again, Longoria and McCutchen bring reputations with them,
Absolutely.
But they still have to produce.
Oh yeah.
So at least in April, pitchers are going to respect Longoria's strike zone. They're going to respect McCutchen's strike zone, and it should help Posey's ability as well to get better pitches. But if Longoria, continues to go downward, or McCutchen, gets 1 year older and shows it, then we're right back where we started. So the Giants are banking on a lot of what ifs, which, I think is important to keep in mind going into the season. However, the same thing you just said about McCutchen being in a contract year, I think everyone on this team, even the guys who have long-term deals like a Posey or a Samardzija, feel like this feels like a contract year. Like this feels like, hey, I better shut up or I'm not going to be here. And So you have a lot of guys who need to prove something, and usually when that happens, you end up getting the best out of a group.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And they know they're not going to get any more excuses if they have another down year.
Yeah, absolutely. And you look at McCutchen, you look at Longoria, and both of those guys are on the back end of their prime right now. McCutchen's 31, Longoria's 32. Perhaps just change of scenery alone is going to be a big thing for both of these guys, because you go from Tampa Bay, a team that really hasn't been that good for a long time, or for a couple of years now. Certainly not what they were back in 2008, 9, and 10. Pittsburgh had that nice little run, but could never get over St. Louis, and now, of course, with the Cubs and the Brewers taking over that division, the Pirates have just kind of gone downward. So maybe for both of these guys to change scenery, to go to a team that has had success in the past, to see and play with a bunch of guys who have had success, won World Series in the past, maybe that adds a little motivation to them. And I know they're in the division that's very, very tough, and we'll talk about the division in a little bit with the Dodgers and the Rockies and the Diamondbacks. I totally get that, but change of scenery, going to San Francisco, beautiful ballpark. The fan base is rabid for that baseball team all the time. It has a tendency to affect players, and it has a tendency to kind of inspire players a little bit. Just kind of give them a little more added motivation as if they needed. Being major league players, it just helps them a little bit more, carrying them through those tough days of the season. And I think if those two guys produce the way they're expected and have good solid seasons, it's just going to take so much pressure off of everybody else. It'll take pressure off of Belt. It'll take pressure off of Posey. It'll take pressure off of Pence. And that could be an offense, potentially, that could do some damage. But again, as you just illustrated just a little while ago, everything has to work perfectly for the Giants to get back to where they were.
Well, and I think to kind of piggyback off both thoughts you just mentioned, you're right. I think that in some ways it does have to work perfectly, but I think the one caveat to that is the two guys you just mentioned specifically in Longoria and McCutchen.
Yeah.
I wrote an article earlier in the off season about how the best thing for both of them is that the other one is here too, because Longoria from his rookie year was the savior that was going to fix Tampa and was going to turn Tampa around, and then he basically did, being the best player on a team that got to the World Series. And then they just stopped trying to win. They started letting guys go. And, regardless of what, Carl Crawford might have been worth or whatever, the fact that they weren't willing to keep some of those guys is something where Longoria realizes, look, I'm not going to get any help. My only help's going to come from the farm system because that's the cheap way to do it. And it grinds on you. And so if he was the only off-season move, then it's like, okay, you come here, you fix Posey in the lineup, you fix, the lineup altogether, you get all the homers. That would have been a lot of pressure on a guy 9 years in the league, new team, new league, good luck, ready, go. So McCutchen basically being put in the exact same spot also takes pressure off each other, because now McCutchen's coming from a team, 9 years with a team. From the day he stepped in the batter's box, he was going to be the guy of the young guys that was going to help Pittsburgh get to a winning season. He got them to a winning season finally. They got to the playoffs finally, and then he sees everyone else around him get traded or moved, and the team going back to their old ways of being cheap. And so that frustration of going to the park every day, knowing that your team's not trying to win the same way other teams are, it grinds on you. And that same grind can be so much better served having it be the opposite, like you're saying, where 40,000 fans in the stands every night, a team that's pulling for you, a team trying to win right now. And, for all the Giants fans who said, oh, we should tear it down, it's like, well, tell that to the guys in the locker room who are trying to be professionals. Tell Buster Posey we're going to have a 3-year rebuild, Tell Madison Bumgarner we're going to have a 3-year rebuild and see what he says. They're not going to want to be a part of it. So even if this is fool's gold, and even if this is delusional thinking to think that all these, 31-year-olds can come together and win, one of the things that's beautiful about baseball is that you still have to play the game, and it's a hard game to play.
Yep.
So if every single guy is a little bit more motivated, a little bit more jacked up, a little bit more interested, a little bit more focused, it's amazing what, if you have 25 guys bought in to the same cause, how much that can do. Because you saw with the Mets' recent success getting to the World Series that not every one of those 25 guys were superstars, but they were all bought into one cause and one goal of getting to the series, and they nearly won a World Series with that in mind. And then as guys left the team, then it's like, well, wait a minute, I thought we were on the verge of a little run here. Why are we stopping?
Yeah.
And so even if the Mets become successful again, there's fans that would have doubt. And I think Giants fans have a right to have some doubt right now that, is this the right way to go?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it's funny, a lot of the Mets moves this year are guys that maybe the Giants would have gotten had the Mets not got them,
Yeah, very true.
Very true. The Jay Bruce's, some of the different additions that you guys had were almost parallel to the guys the Giants were interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And, but I go back to, people that have been critical of Johnny Cueto, because they've said whenever his team isn't motivated to win, he kind of falls off. And then when his team is good, he really amps up. And, part of me is like, yeah, that's kind of what sports is. When the game doesn't matter, win or lose, we're not going to win, the season, then what's the point of playing? We're supposed to play to win. Let's go out and win. And so, someone that's like, oh, you should love the game and you should play hard no matter what. It's like, yeah, in an idealistic world, that's exactly true. But if the end game is we're not going to win, then guys get frustrated, So when you saw Johnny Cueto at his best, he was leading the Royals to a World Series, and when Johnny Cueto struggled, it was with a Giants team that lost 98 games. So had he won 3 or 4 more games, the Giants would have lost, 94 games.
Yeah.
So they still wouldn't have got to the playoffs. So I can see guys just, you give them that little spark and it completely 180s their motivation, which completely improves the performance.
You just hit something right out of the park, because you just mentioned something about that added motivation, and maybe Johnny Cueto just isn't that kind of guy to be the leader of a rotation, or to be the jumper cube, if you will, for a baseball team. And that's what Madison Bumgarner has been for the Giants over the years. He has been the guy to really get things moving for that team. Even in 2016, wasn't a great team going into the postseason, but they relied on him to get things done. They needed him big time in that wild card game against the Mets, and of course he delivered with that brilliant performance against them, a complete game, and got him into the postseason. Year before that, he carried them to the World Series championship. From afar, it felt like once he went down with the injury, the dirt bike injury, and was lost for a big chunk of the season, it just felt like all the air kind of came out like a balloon, just ran out of the balloon for the Giants, and it just went downhill. So, to me, he is as important, not just from the fact that he starts every 5th day, but just from the standpoint of knowing, for everyone in that clubhouse, everyone in that rotation, knowing we got our horse on the hill, or we got our horse in the dugout. He is here with us. Something about Madison Bumgarner just kind of pushes that team ahead. And I think without him last year, it really, really did hurt that team big time. Not just from the starts, but just everything else.
Well, and everything you said is 100% true. I think what gets added to that is when you lose your number one, Cueto becomes your number one, Samardzija becomes your number two. I mean, every guy gets put up a rung, and the Giants didn't have depth last year. They went into the season with 5 starting pitchers. They went into the season, with one third baseman, with 1 first baseman. They had no depth really anywhere. So anytime somebody struggled or anytime somebody got hurt, their replacement just was not ready for prime time.
Yeah.
And so Madison Bumgarner going down really hurt 5 pitchers, or at least 5 slots in that starting staff. Because when you have someone like Matt Cain in the last year of his career, you don't need him being the 4th starter. You need him being the 5th starter. When Matt Moore is having the worst regular season of his career and he's really struggling, you don't need him to be a 3rd starter. So when you have guys who are really struggling, they don't need to be asked, hey, can you do a little bit more for us? They need to be asked, can you do a little bit less for us? And when they didn't have that depth to kind of fill in the spots, that really hurt. And I think the Giants came into the season with about 23 guys and a couple of Band-Aids, but they really had no other guys. It wasn't like there were some injuries, in preseason or in spring training, I should say. where as soon as we get that guy back, we're good. So when they were already struggling and then Bumgarner went down, what air was even there in the first place went out. And I think if we're really being honest, there wasn't much air at the time of the injury in the first place. So whatever air was left kind of just went away at that point, because once you find out he's going to be out for a while, it didn't even matter what happened. The fact that it was him being irresponsible and that kind of stuff can go into a whole other part of that conversation. But the reality is that they were already struggling to find wins, and it was the worst season possible for that to be the case in April and May when 3 teams in that division were going to make the playoffs.
Yeah.
They really did pick a heck of a year to be struggling with injuries and struggling with that.
Yeah, they really did. I mean, especially with the way the Rockies and the Diamondbacks played. I mean, both of those teams kind of came out of nowhere. I mean, all of a sudden the Rockies are getting the kind of starting pitching that, with outside of 2007, we really haven't seen them get. Bud Black did a great job with that rotation. Of course, that offense was phenomenal. Arenado became if he wasn't a household name with fantasy baseball owners, he certainly became a household name for a lot of people across the country. Maybe never heard of him or paid attention to the Rockies last year. And of course, even with the Diamondbacks, the efforts of what they've been able to do down there. So those two teams getting really, really good, really, really quick last year certainly didn't help things out. And you probably saw a lot of those matchups last year with those two teams. How do you think the Giants this year could stack up against those two?
Well, the funny thing, I mean, first of all, the Giants could end up having a much better year this year and still finish 4th.
Yeah.
They could win, 81 games or 85 games and finish 4th. I mean, that's how strong the division is. I will say that what I've seen from the NL West in general is if you have pitching, no matter what your hitting's doing, pitching will carry you, and that's what's gotten the Giants into the playoffs 4 times, in recent history. But it's also why the Rockies and the Diamondbacks lasted last year.
Yeah.
Because the Rockies always have an above-average offense. Last year was a very, very good offense, better than previous years. But it was their pitching and their starting pitching, and then especially their bullpen, that really carried them in those first few months. And so having Greg Holland and others really made that game shorter for those starting pitchers, which took a lot of pressure off. So a young guy like Freeland or some of these other guys who were coming out like gangbusters, they didn't have to pitch 8-9 innings. They knew if they just get to the 5th or 6th that their bullpen would take care of them. And I think the funny thing about a baseball season is that, if you have momentum, it's amazing what you can convince yourself. And I think that the Colorado Rockies staff was way too young to be that good last year, and yet they just kept winning. So when they just kept winning, they just felt like that's what we do now. We're winners. And that confidence just created that perfect storm where now those starting pitchers go out there not only with confidence, but knowing that even if they give up a couple runs, that offense is going to bail them out. Or even if they give up a couple runs, that bullpen's going to help them.
Yeah.
And so even if they lose a game, they probably won't lose the series, right? I think the Giants, in the other extreme, they'd go into a series if they lose the first game of the series, they already feel like, well, we're probably going to lose this series now, instead of feeling like, oh, we can still win 2 out of 3. And so it's that kind of confidence where the Diamondbacks pitching staff was so good early on that it didn't matter that they didn't have a JD Martinez bat initially, that they were able to get enough runs to win games early in the season. Then when it got to where, okay, we definitely have a chance to playoffs, then they go out and get a bat like Martinez to help them even more. So I think that's what's always going to tell the story. The Dodgers still have the best overall pitching staff, I think, in the division. So I think it's impossible not to have them be the favorite for the NL West. But if the Arizona and Colorado staffs can be just as good or just close to what they were last year, then those are going to be 2 very tough teams all year.
Yeah.
Because those parks just ask you to score runs. Like you're going to score 4 or 5 runs by accident some games because you get a bloop that just keeps going, or you get a lazy fly ball that goes over the fence. And so you're going to accidentally score a few runs in some games in Arizona and in Colorado. But if you don't have the pitching, the other team's going to score all those runs too. So that's why I think Colorado there were so many years where Colorado would have these amazing lineups and wouldn't win because they'd lose 9-8 because they couldn't stop teams from scoring.
Yeah.
You know, and so again, I don't know if the Diamondbacks are going to be as good. I mean, they've essentially replaced JD Martinez with Gerard Dyson.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's at least on their 25 man. So they're definitely worse than they were at the end of last year, but they were so good at the end of last year that drop off might still be better than some of the other teams in the NL and in the NL West specifically. So it could be very well that all four teams end up with 81 wins or more. And if that's the case, then it could be anyone that wins the division.
Yeah, and not to mention the good pitching on all three of those teams, but also offensively, all three of those teams had one or two guys that just exploded offensively. With the Dodgers, of course, we saw it with Cody Bellinger, Justin Turner, even Yasiel Puig still, produced a good amount of home runs, 28 last year. But Turner and Bellinger really had big years last year. Colorado getting a lot out of Blackman with a big season, career year for him. Arenado I mentioned before, and as you said with Goldschmidt and at the time J.D. Martinez down in Arizona. So you have the combination of good pitching. We know what the Dodgers can bring on the pitching staff, but the good young pitching out of both Colorado and Arizona, and also just the firepower offensively. I think that's also kind of the motivating factor for the Giants this year, and going out and adding a couple of big veteran bats like Longoria and McCutchen, just try to compete with some of these other teams that just have, not just young, but also just have so much firepower offensively, and that. Leads to my next point. It's going to be important for the Giants, not just with having a healthy Bumgarner and Cueto, but the back end of the rotation. I know a lot of people kind of think the back end of the rotation just kind of wave it off, but Ty Blach, Chris Stratton, these are two young guys, both 27 years old. Both are having pretty solid spring training so far this year. It's going to be important for these two young guys to kind of come into their own this year and really solidify this rotation for the Giants if they're going to have a chance.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's a lot to expect for two guys that, even though 27, is for some guys means they've been in the league for 3 or 4 years. Mm-hmm. For these guys, they don't have that. Stratton's got very little time in the major leagues, and Block really only has the one season. So they're basically coming in with, hey, this is your job to lose, go get it. And for their credit, that's been the case so far. Those two guys have said, okay, let's do this, and they've performed. That doesn't mean they're going to perform in April and May, but it very well could. But I think the one nice thing this year as opposed to last year is they have two young guys in the minors in Tyler Beede and Andrew Suarez, who mm-hmm. I think the Giants feel like if we have to, we're comfortable with either one of them jumping into that fifth starter spot. And then with a guy like Derek Holland, who's on the roster still, that is obviously a former Texas Ranger pitcher, is another left-hander they're looking at who could possibly be a fifth starter. So what last year was 5 starters and Ty Blach is now 8 starters for 8 starters for 5 spots. So that doesn't necessarily mean Blach and Stratton are good to go. There still could be a lot of question marks there, and both of them are going to have some problems, I think, being consistent every 5th day, which is the hardest thing with a starting pitcher. I also think, though, that adding someone like Tony Watson, mm-hmm. adding Sam Dyson middle of last year, and if Melanson's healthy, when Will Smith comes back in May, suddenly you can have a shortened game for those two guys. So if Ty Blach is struggling early in the year, getting through a lineup a third time, or if Chris Stratton's having a hard time getting through a lineup a third time, then they'll have that protection by May or June. But again, we can say that all we want. Will they be relevant in May and June too? So it all kind of comes to a head. If they're not winning, it won't matter anyway. If they are winning, then that's going to be a huge help for those two. Is that even if they do struggle, they're going to have some protection. And I think finally, at least for the Giants, they have some protection on their end. If Blach or Stratton don't perform, they have some guys they feel like are major leaguers that they can, put in those spots, whether it's short-term or even long-term, to replace them, that, could very well be successful. But again, that's a lot of what-ifs that is kind of becoming almost the unwanted mantra of this season is, well, will this be the case or will it not? So with all these questions, at least there's some depth there to have some buffer. Because at least in last year, that was the one thing that became painfully obvious, was that this depth was not there.
Looking at that schedule, and it's going to be a tough schedule because 7 of the first 9 games are against L.A. You have 6 games after that against the Arizona Diamondbacks. So right out of the gate, the Giants are going to have a big challenge in this division, facing 2 of the top teams right out of the gate in that division with Arizona and Los Angeles. So getting off to a good start is going to be very important. Is this a big year? Is this kind of a must year for Jeff Samardzija? Because you mentioned it earlier, had a really inconsistent year last year, only won 9 games last season. He's never really been that pitcher who's going to go out there, win 15 games for you, pitch to an ERA that's, around 3.5 or lower than that. He's never been that kind of pitcher. He's always been the guy who's going to be around 500, have an ERA that's close to 4. To me, this really is kind of like a make-or-break year for him in a lot of ways.
Well, it's absolutely a make-or-break year for him when it relates to the Giants, because if the Giants struggle, he's a guy that's going to go at the deadline because he does have value. His contract, even though it's $15 million a year, is not as egregious as some other guys that are out there.
Yeah.
It's only for 2 more years, so suddenly by the time July rolls around, it'll only be for a year and a half. So suddenly, a team that might be a small market team, think of the Twins last year, suddenly they might be really interested. From every report I read during the season, I think the Astros were one of the teams very interested in Samardzija last year, and then they found a way to get Verlander, so they didn't need Samardzija. And I think most playoff teams will be interested in him more so than any other pitcher the Giants have, because Cueto has 3 more years left after this year, and Bumgarner's not going anywhere. So Samardzija becomes the best option if you're asking the Giants for starting pitching. And because he'd only have a year and a half left on his contract, it's not a huge financial commitment. And I think the Giants would also, if they're struggling again, now we've been struggling for 2 years. Maybe we do need to cut ties with some of our guys. So Samardzija, Pence, McCutchen, you guys, good luck in your next home. And we're gonna, and $45 million, goes out the window, and we regroup. But I do think that if Samardzija has a strong year, then that in turn probably will mean so will the Giants, and he'll probably finish his contract out, because I do think the Giants appreciate the skill sets he does have, and one of the key ones is just being able to pitch innings. The fact that he can pitch into the 6th, 7th, or 8th inning a lot of the time, or just pitch 110, 120 pitches when you need him to keep your team fresh over a long season. I think the Giants have clearly showed over the last several years with Bochy that they still value that, so that they don't kill their bullpen. And I think we saw with the playoffs the last couple of years, the bullpens are becoming much more valuable to have a good bullpen, but it's also becoming much harder to still have a good bullpen in October. And I think, Astros fans and Dodgers fans, Cubs and Indians fans from the last 2 World Series can attest that, for as good as Andrew Miller was, for as good as Jensen was, you really can't just run those guys into the ground. And you have to have more than 1 or 2 guys. And so, that's why the Giants look at someone like Samardzija, Cueto, and Bumgarner as such valuable starting pitchers, because they can protect the bullpen, which I think teams are starting to get away from. They're thinking, oh, now that we have all these bullpen arms, we can just have our starters go 5. And it's like, yeah, that's great for the short term, like in the regular season when you need to get to the playoffs. But then your playoffs come and those pitchers have thrown 80 appearances during the season, and by the time October hits, their arms falling off.
Exactly. I mean, it's a problem that we see with all 30 teams. I mean, all these managers overmanage, and it's we talk about pace of play in baseball, and baseball's doing all these ridiculous things with pitch clocks and mound visits. Now I hear this afternoon about having a runner on second base, which is actually a rule that's used in independent league baseball. Now they're talking about it in the major leagues for extra innings, all to improve pace of play. It's to me the biggest issue is managers over managing. And going out there, I want to have a lefty against lefty. I want a righty against a righty. Oh, this guy hits better. This guy pitches better against righties. This guy pitches. I mean, all these. I understand analytics are so important, but sometimes these guys just go by the book way too much, and it comes back to bite them. It really does in a lot of ways, and not just with what happens in that game, but as you mentioned, down the road, and you get into a postseason. That guy has pitched in 85 games and has close to 100 innings. And the guy's arm's ready to fall off in a big game, Game 4, with their team down by a run, needing a win in a series to move on. So it's a problem. I think that's the biggest problem of all for baseball is the fact that there's just too much over-managing. I would love to give... and I hear this from baseball guys all the time. They would love to go back to a time where starting pitchers pitched the full game, 7, 8, 9 innings at a time. We just don't live in that world anymore. We haven't lived in that world in a long, long time now. But I think that we have to get to a point now where we have to trust the starting pitchers. I know that a lot of teams want to protect guys with innings limits. That's been a big thing lately. But we have to start to trust our starting pitchers to go out there in a situation, even in a situation where they may not be pitching well, just to eat some innings or have a guy come up from the minor leagues, come out of the bullpen, give you some innings, especially when you need it in the middle of July, August. There needs to be more of that kind of strategy and thought process for a lot of these teams moving forward. In my mind, if they're going to be contending teams.
It's funny because the first thing for me is I don't know how many people are saying that pace of play is a problem outside of the people in the front office of Major League Baseball. I know that sometimes the casual fan might say, "Why is this game 3.5 hours?" But at the same time, thing you just said that does make sense about why the games are taking longer. Imagine the other extreme of just leaving guys in because you don't want to go lefty, lefty, righty, righty, and they're terrible against the other side of the plate because that's what you've seen is that, what we saw for years with the Giants was Sergio Romo was one of the best right-handed pitchers against right-handers the Giants maybe have ever had. Javier Lopez was amazing against left-handers. But they were nowhere near as effective when it was a hitter on the other side of the plate. So if I said, okay, because of pace of play, I'm going to have Javier Lopez pitch the entire inning, that inning's going to go long because he's going to give up a bunch of hits. And so if you're a manager, if I let my guy go out there and get killed, what are the chances I'm going to still be a manager next year?
Yeah, you're right.
Bruce Bochy might have some leash as far as getting fired. But I'd say of 30 teams, 20 managers have no assurances whatsoever that a bad season, won't be their last. So, one of the fascinating things I've seen over the years is how quickly a guy will win Manager of the Year and then get fired. And it usually is about a 2 or 3 year window where a guy will get Manager of the Year and then 2 or 3 years later he'll be fired. And it's because of the two extremes. A guy went way above his head with a team that wasn't supposed to win, and they won, so he got Manager of the Year. And then 2-3 years later, they went right back to their baseball cards, and suddenly it's the manager's fault because he's cheaper to fire than the players.
Yep.
So you let him go.
Look at Boston.
And so if I'm a manager, I'm absolutely putting whatever pitcher I think is going to give me the best matchup against whoever I'm going to face, however many times I need to. This new rule that happens where there's a limit to how many times you can go visit, a part of me actually thinks that's kind of a cool thing because it adds to the strategy, because it forces teams to be more strategic about when they go out. And so if baseball is anything, it's a strategic game. So adding a rule that creates more strategy is a good thing. It's just kind of sad that their rationale is because they're trying to shorten the game by, 60 seconds or, 2.5 minutes. Because Bruce Bochy walks slow to the mound, so it is a little funny to me that some of these ideas, whether it's the automatic walk or whatever, how much time are we saving? This man on second idea that they want to incorporate in the minor leagues. The minor leagues, there's so many things in place about a guy not being allowed to pitch more than a certain number of pitches, no matter the situation of the game. Like some young guy who's a phenom okay, he can't pitch more than 75 pitches a game. Well, if you're putting guys like that on a restriction, then why not have the game be 9 innings max?
Yeah.
Say, even if the game's tied, that's it, game's over. Because I've been to San Jose Giants games where the games have gone 17 innings. And that can't be good for the health of a young pitcher. That can't be good for, a guy who's maybe on 2 days rest, but he's the only pitcher left in the bullpen, so he gets to pitch 4 more innings. That can't be good for that guy's long-term health. And if I'm a minor leaguer making no money, living with a host family, I don't want to go out there. I don't want to jeopardize my career over the 16th inning of a regular season game.
I think that also brings into the debate, because you're making a lot of great points there, but this also brings the idea of maybe expanding rosters. Let's just use the Major League roster as an example. It's 25 men. Would it kill anybody if they expanded the roster to 28, so they could add a couple more pitchers? I don't think it would be too much of a problem in my mind. I certainly know that a lot of managers would love to have a couple extra pitchers coming out of their bullpen if they could use it, especially in that kind of game where you're going 15, 16 innings, which can happen. Obviously, happens way too often, especially in the middle of the season.
Well, and let's put your number of 28 to real use.
Yeah.
Right now, you don't think there's 90 guys that are free agents right now that wouldn't kill for one of those 90 spots?
Of course.
Whether it's a Carlos Gonzalez or a Jose Bautista that can come in and be on a playoff team as the extra bat, or a starting pitcher that can come in and be the sixth starter, long man that can be that guy who, if the game goes long or if a starter gets pulled in the second inning, can be that bridge to the bullpen. So I think when you look at what that would mean, in most cases, it's not going to necessarily mean that Joey Bats or a Cargo is going to get the spot. It probably is going to go to a guy making no money from the minor leagues. But if it's from the minor leagues, they're making so much more money than they would in AAA. So if you give 90 minor leaguers a major league job because you expand the rosters to 28, that actually would be a beautiful thing for giving those 90 guys an opportunity to be on a major league roster. And in some cases, it would go to those veterans that are looking for one more shot. But in a lot of cases, it's going to be that sixth starting pitcher. So the Giants might decide, okay, Andrew Suarez, you're a left-hander, you're a starter. We want you to be up with the big club now instead of pitching every fifth day in AAA. And what that does is it also trickles down to every other level. So now a double-A starter gets to pitch in AAA and make more money. Now a single-A starter gets to pitch in double-A and make more money, and so on. So I can't imagine how that would hurt the game, having 2 or 3 more spots where you can get another hitter, get at least one more pitcher, and then also protect everybody else from being in a 17-inning marathon or from having to pitch on, no days rest for the 4th or 5th day. And those things where that happens in some cases with some relief pitchers or for some, hitters who are in a slump, but they're the only ones out there, gives those veterans a day off, so they can get more rest. So that when it comes to October, we can get better baseball.
Very quickly here, we're going to wrap this thing up here on this open mic program on Sports Talk Nation. Michael Cohen, along with Michael Saltzman, again, who writes for Around the Foghorn on Fansided. Mike, how do you see the Giants' season? I know it's very, very early. We still got a couple weeks here to go before spring training. Gun to the head, how do you think that the Giants can do this year as far as their ability to compete and maybe even get back into the postseason, wild card even this year?
I think it's going to be hard to make the playoffs this year because of how talented the teams are in the NL West. Because it's one thing if there are 4 or 5 teams total in the NL that were strong, but when most of the best teams of the National League are in our division, it makes it where, just your point earlier with the schedule, they could be a pretty good team this year and leave April, with a losing record easily, and it's only because they lost to Arizona and LA a few times.
Yeah.
So, losing to good teams isn't necessarily a bad thing, but starting the April with a losing streak or starting April with, a 4-10 record, actually might not be indicative of the kind of team they are, but 10-4 sounds a lot better. And 10-4 sounds a lot more like a team that can challenge for a playoff spot. So, if gun to my head, I'm saying maybe an 82-80 season.
Yeah.
That they can have a win season, that they can be a strong team, but until I see this group in the regular season, there's too many what-ifs to just be like, oh, yeah, McCutcheon's going to just fit in perfectly. Longoria's just going to fit in perfectly. Melanson's going to be super healthy. Cueto's not going to have any injuries. Bumgarner's going to be back to his old self. Posey's going to be better. Pence will have, found a youth movement. Belt won't get any concussions and he'll stay healthy. There's so many what-ifs that, to say they're going to win 90 or to say they're going to win the division, I think is a little ridiculous at this point. I do think, though, if they win a few games, even if they just go 500 through that kind of gauntlet you mentioned of LA and Arizona multiple times, that's going to show them that not only can we play with these guys, but we're right there.
Yeah.
We're right on the cusp of something that can be looked at as positive. Right now, I think this is a 500 team that can absolutely have a winning season, but that's about as far as I can go.
I think that's very fair. I think the Giants are probably in that range as well, 82, 83 wins. I do think Colorado and Arizona are going to come back to the pack just a little bit here. I have questions about the Rockies starting pitching. I do have questions even about Arizona. How are they going to do? Can that offense repeat what it did last year, scoring over 800 runs? Can the pitching be as good? So I have some questions there. So I do think both of those teams, even LA, I don't see LA winning 104 games. I think they'll win 95 or so, but not 104. So those teams will come back to the pack a little bit. I do think the Giants are certainly much better than what their record was last year. I say 82, 83 wins. They'll be, if they can get some breaks, as you mentioned, and win some of those close games, I could see them kind of sneaking into that wild card mix with Colorado, with Arizona, Milwaukee, St. Louis, the Mets. I could see them in that kind of mix for a potential for one of those wild cards if they can get a little bit of help and even a little bit of luck for that matter during the season.
Yeah, and I think your point is spot on about Colorado and Arizona may not win as many games, and then obviously the Dodgers winning 104 again is very unlikely, even though they might be just as good or better. But, teams know Bellinger now. He's not going to shock anyone. They know he's a dangerous hitter. They're not going to challenge him the way they did, first couple of months of last year. So Charlie Blackmon's not going to surprise anyone, with a blowout year. He already had that. So, to your point, that's exactly why they might come back to earth a little bit. And the Giants are better. So some of the games they lost to those three powerhouse teams, they might win this year. That creates losses for them. So it's all kind of a, puzzle piece in that way. But just like last year, Colorado was a surprise. Arizona was a surprise. Milwaukee, being relevant again is a surprise. There's going to be some team we don't see coming that is going to at least be hot for the first half of the year. Last year, Cincinnati started strong and then faded. Maybe they have another good first half. You never know what teams are going to shine in April and May. So that could lead to a team, whether it's New York or whether it's, Philadelphia, all of a sudden coming through with a hot April, and now they're the talk of the town. And then they don't have the negativity in their locker room about, well, it can't last, because why not? So they go out to that next game and next series with that why not mentality, and they win some more. And I think that's exactly what Colorado and Arizona did last year, and they were able to ride that all the way to the playoffs. And so why not us is certainly something that could happen with other teams, but I think that's what the Giants are kind of feeling. Nick Hundley, who was one of their more unsung heroes last year of the few guys they had, him and Hunter Pence kind of have this mantra of just kind of looking at it like, a tiger a lion who's full, they're not going to go out and be motivated, but a starving lion is going to go out and try and eat. And so we're a bunch of starving lions trying to get those wins back, trying to get those games back into our favor. So, the Giants sure picked a weird way of getting them ready for 2018 by being so poor in 2017, but there's a lot of guys with pride on that team and a lot of veterans that they don't want their careers to end with another bad season or to have to change, their careers, 180 degrees by having this team fall apart. So you got a lot of motivated guys, a lot of them in the last year of their contracts, that are going to go out there as they're saying, starving lions, trying to, prove everyone wrong. And motivated athletes, a pretty tough thing to stop.
Absolutely. We'll see how it works. And, you mentioned teams that could be a surprise team. I think Philadelphia could be one of those teams. They're kind of scary right now going into the season. We'll see what the Mets do. You mentioned them. We'll see what San Francisco could do. So, Mike, I really want to thank you so much again for coming aboard. Before I let you go, very quickly, we got just tell me a little bit more about Fansided, what you're doing for them.
Oh yeah, so I write for them, every week, and right now we're putting together a lot of great pieces about the upcoming season, and it's a great opportunity for me. A lot of great guys I work with there. Daniel Sperry's one of the editors there. He's a great guy, and the whole group is just, they're a bunch of motivated guys. We're not quite the starving lions that the Giants are, but we love this team, and we love covering them and seeing them succeed. But we're also, and most of us with strong journalism backgrounds, so we're also willing to be honest when they struggle, and look for what's actually happening on the field, and not so much just the fan perspective. But we also have tons of fan geared articles trying to get the kids out there interested, the diehard fan interested. So it's just a fun place to have the freedom to write about what we care about, write about what we like, and also try to help the fans, know what's going on.
Awesome, man. Awesome. Starving lions. That's all of us right now. Mike, I really want to thank you so much, man. I really want to thank you, man, for coming aboard. I'll talk to you down the road. We're going to do something else real soon, man.
That sounds good. Always love being on your show. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks a lot, man. Take care.
You too.
All right, folks, that was Michael Saltzman. Again, he is of Around the Foghorn, which is on fansided.com. Remember to follow us on the social media, folks, facebook.com/openmicprogram, @openmicnj on Twitter, and on right here on YouTube. Like and subscribe right here on the Sports Talk Nation, right here on YouTube. We'll talk to you next time.